Good day, everyone. My name is Ali Pabrai, and I'm very excited to be here with all of you for this whole day on CCPA, devoted to CCPA. Very excited with working closely with the ISACA Orange County chapter. And the focus of my presentation today is on CCPA readiness, from policy to practice. And over the past several months, as all of us know, the enforcement was effective July 1, but organizations have been looking to beef up their capabilities with respect to CCPA readiness, making sure that they are in compliance with the mandates and all that. And also, given the fact that in the election here, obviously in California, we had Proposition 24, which I think many of us refer to as CCPA version 2. So one of my themes for my presentation today was to think of 2021. So 2021 starts now. Here in November, we should start thinking about what can we do to uplift our cybersecurity, our compliance program, and obviously have it influenced, ensure that it meets the requirements of CCPA. And not only do we have to look at the existing requirements, but the Proposition 24, from what I understand, has been approved. And we should be also looking at 2023, which is when it will go into effect. So start to think about taking some key steps, some important steps to ensure that we are looking at the enhancements being made with the CCPA standard. So I've organized my presentation along three key areas. The first one being best practice, kind of where are things now from an industry perspective? What are companies doing, organizations doing? What are some areas that they may be struggling with? So we'll take a look at that in terms of kind of where are we now. A really important area that organizations have to ensure that they're doing a good job with. Topic 2, which is policy. But I think even preceding the policy, what I want to also talk about is the assessment to get a sense of, what are the other compliance mandates that an organization has to address, and how does that align with CCPA requirements that obviously should be addressed in the same suite of policies. And then I want to close my presentation by kind of looking ahead to 2021. And like I mentioned, we should start to think about 2023 now, to think about what are some of the things that we're going to have to be prepared for with the additional requirements associated with CCPA. So we'll talk about the best practices. We'll take a look at assessment, policies, evidences, and then some key steps to achieve. Now that's a key word, credible. We want to make sure that we've got credible CCPA compliance. And what that means is that we've got an evidence-ready program, So on the right side, the graphic kind of summarizes some key words, some key phrases associated with CCPA. And the information in the center, obviously, front and center to CCPA is California resident information, and we're talking about personal information. Also, in my presentations, I always believe the past is a mirror to the future. And so words of wisdom, Sun Tzu, about 2,000 or 2,500 years ago, and where he said, in the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity, from the art of war. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that body of work. And I think these words echo, because now when you look at Proposition 24 and all of the additional requirements associated with CCPA, there's going to be, again, confusion. What do we need to do? How are we going to do it? And all of that. And so that's where I think there's also an opportunity to really improve the privacy and the security posture of organizations as it relates to CCPA. Now, I love to put together infographics, and this is a simple one-page infographic, and I'll be happy to share it with you. My email address will be available at the end of this presentation. And we don't have enough time to go through all of this. This year obviously has impacted all of us personally and professionally with respect to COVID-19. But COVID-19 has also had a significant disruptive impact on organizations' cybersecurity programs. And the reason I think we gotta make sure we keep things in context is because CCPA is probably one of several distinct mandates, whether it's federal, whether it's state, that your organization has to comply with. And so we got to take a look at that. One of the statistics, just to put things in context, that we see in today's environment, and again, 2021 starts now, and we've got to be prepared for that, is that a new organization will fall victim to ransomware every 11 seconds in 2021. And some information that I just published from the Wall Street Journal is that it is 19 days, 19 days that an organization is in fact impacted by a ransomware attack. And more than 81% of these attacks have taken place in organizations with less than 1,000 employees. And the reason I bring up ransomware, although that has nothing to do with what is the core topic here, is that we got to make sure when we are looking at privacy and security compliance, that we are clearly on our radar. We've got clearly all of the major regulations and mandates we have to comply with. And just a quick 15 seconds, in California, because this CCPA impacts all of us in California, businesses, but in California, there was also another regulation, SB 327, that relates to IoT cybersecurity, Internet of Things cybersecurity. So when your organization is assessing the state of CCPA compliance, you also have to be putting that in the context of what are some of the other mandates that we've got to be in compliance with. And finally, coming back to this infographic, words of wisdom from Peter Drucker. I'm sure many of you have read his work, Managing in Turbulent Times, right? The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself, but to act with yesterday's logic. And yesterday, in the context of CCPA, is the current requirements associated with CCPA. But as you are looking to 2021, you've got to be influenced by the requirements that are in Proposition 24. And many of the speakers today are going to be talking to that point, so I'm not going to belabor that point. But at least from a policy perspective, from the perspective of the assessments and all of that, and also knowledge acquisition, you got to make sure that we clearly understand what those requirements are. So to put things in context, like I said, the past is the mirror to the future. You know, if you just go back a couple of decades, you know, we had HIPAA privacy, HIPAA security. And again, the world is flat, getting flatter, right? And nothing could be more compelling as an evidence than the COVID times that we are all living in terms of the world being flat. So Singapore's regulation, the PDPA, obviously GDPR, many of you are familiar with, and there have been a lot of comparisons that have been made between CCPA and GDPR. And then obviously CCPA as well as the Brazil data protection law, both of which have been introduced in 2020. So these are very relevant and very important bodies of work. So when we are looking at assessments and best practices and policies and all of that, we got to make sure that we are at least familiar with these other important references as we look to articulate our organization's policy and practice. And here is another look. The only one that I think I wanted to point out on this slide was South Africa. I had previously last year given a presentation in Johannesburg, and one of the things that we spent some time talking about when I was there was protection of personal information, POPI. So again, just be familiar with some of these mandates and regulations that are out there. Now, I've also put together, and I'd be happy to share this with this infographic with all of you. I think it's a good executive summary, and you could create like 4 or 5 slides out of this for executive presentations and all of that. But for me, when I'm communicating with audiences to get a pulse on kind of, okay, the core requirements associated with CCPA, comparing it to GDPR and all of that, this is, I think, a good reference to have. So you can see here on the top left, we don't have enough time to go through it, and I'm assuming the audience is already CCPA literate, but what are the business obligations. What is it that business have to ensure that they're doing in terms of readiness, the best practice that businesses are in fact implementing, and also the penalties associated with CCPA. And then we know, although we are in California, many of you may also be impacted with GDPR. And what you don't want is a separate set of policy documents related to CCPA and a separate set of policy documents related to GDPR and another set of policy documents related to SB 327 or whatever else it might be. You want to make sure that you've got a unified privacy policy set that is addressing the mandates that your organization has to be in compliance with. Now, this infographic is another one. This one actually I just recently updated because I wanted to. It's like peeling layers of the onion. So this dives a little deeper in terms of very specific requirements in terms of best practices. And my core focus is that graphic that you see towards the left top center, CCPA best practice, because as we've been working with organizations, enabling them to understand and implement the CCPA requirements. These are the 7 areas that I have found organizations have to take specific steps in. And I'm going to be talking to you in a minute or two about that. But I love this infographic because it kind of summarizes, all right, what are the rights of consumers? What are some of the business responsibilities? And then who has to comply with this important mandate? So you're going to be hearing a lot today about CCPA 2.0, but I think we got to start thinking today in 2020, we got to start thinking about 2023. And there are 2 really important dates in 2023. The first one, obviously, is January 1 of 2023, which is when CPRA, right? No shortage of acronyms here. The California Privacy Rights Act, CPRA. I've got to pronounce that correctly. And one of the key elements of that is the establishment of the California Privacy Protection Agency is going to be responsible for the enforcement. And also another thing that I think is important for us to start thinking about, we know that CCPA, the focus is on California resident personal information, but now with CPRA, they've introduced an additional term, sensitive personal information. And so got to make sure when you're looking at your policy updates for 2021, start to think about, okay, what are the mandates I have to comply with? What is it that is the focus of CCPA? And what are we going to be looking at with respect to CPRA? And so that additional definition of sensitive personal information, it's important to identify, do we come into contact with that sensitive personal information? And if we do, that's going to require some additional safeguards and capabilities to appropriately protect that information. And so one of the other areas that CPRA is going to have an impact creates a chief auditor who's going to have the authority to audit business data practices. And now here's another important piece. We talk about privacy mandates and we talk about security, cybersecurity mandates. And the second bullet that you see here, CPRA. So as you look ahead to 2023, further requires high-risk data processors, right? So if you're coming into contact with CCPA sensitive or highly sensitive information, to perform regular cybersecurity audits and regular risk assessments, right? Because you want to understand what is this type of information about the California resident my organization is coming into contact with, and what am I doing to protect and enforce that? And they're looking at the enforcement date potentially of July 1 of 2023. So we must all, I think this is another area that when in terms of best practice, from a policy perspective, organizations that have been working on this for some time, one of the areas they look at specifically is what is that personal information that they come into contact with as it relates to the current state of CCPA. And you want to make sure that that is defined in the context of the other requirements. So for example, your organization may come into contact with personal information as defined by CCPA, but it may also come into contact with European Union personal data, right? What is EUPD, European Union personal data, and that obviously has GDPR implications. So you want to, first of all, clearly identify, and from a best practice perspective, that's what we're seeing in the industry, is to identify what type of sensitive, what type of confidential information is the organization coming into contact with, and then clearly articulating that is what we're seeing organizations do. And that bullet list, I think, is very important for policies to bring out, because you gotta be specific in that context about the type of sensitive information that has an impact in terms of meeting compliance mandates, whether that's California or European Union or whatever that might be. This is the core slide that I wanted to really spend some time on, because this is what we are seeing in the industry in terms of 2020. And the first one being is that there has to be those organizations that have done a good job versus those organizations that have struggled are the organizations that have clearly assigned responsibility, and that has been formally defined in terms of the role, the responsibility, and that responsibility is documented in terms of CCPA compliance, right? Who is the individual? Is that going to be the compliance officer? Is it going to be the privacy officer? Is it the information security officer? Whoever that might be, you want to make sure that that responsibility has been clearly defined, communicated to the entire organization so people are aware of that, right? So that first step is very important, obviously is documented, and the job role responsibility should reflect that. That's what we see. Knowledge acquisition, the second area that we see successful organizations with respect to having a vibrant CCPA compliance program is where they have studied the mandate, they've understood the mandate, and now they have communicated those requirements to two target audiences. And this is important, the target audiences that you communicate that. One being, it's communicated to senior executives and leadership to understand that this is what needs to be done by the organization to be in compliance. And two, all members of your workforce, right? They cannot be illiterate when it comes to CCPA. So just making sure that your policies are communicated. There's no reason to keep any of that information confidential in terms of what are the requirements, how does it impact the business, what are our responsibilities. So that knowledge acquisition piece, where I would phrase it a little differently in the sense that successful organizations are one where members of the workforce are not illiterate when it comes to the core requirements of CCPA, at least at a high level. And that's what we see from a best practice perspective. Policy and process update. Now, obviously, the policy has to be updated. What we see is organizations are looking very closely, like I mentioned, at the definition of personal information, also looking at what type of additional confidential information the organization comes into contact with. So for example, if you're in the healthcare industry, you're obviously coming into contact with protected health information. You may have HIPAA privacy policies and all of that. And so that's what you're going to be looking at is, can we have a unified set of policies that addresses these the diversity of mandates that we have to be in compliance with. Now that's policies. And I think there's a distinct target audience for policies, which is all members of the workforce. That should be communicated, right? Process ties into your procedures. So if there are specific areas that are identified from your policies that address CCPA in particular, and I've got a couple of examples I'm going to be sharing with you in a few minutes, then those procedures and the processes associated with those have to be consistent, right? So we cannot have a process divorced of a documented procedure. And so that's what we see in terms of best practice. Organizations have put in the effort to ensure that the policies and the processes are aligned. So that's there. Data mapping, that's another important area. Is where in your organization, what are the systems, the websites, your servers, your databases, where you do come into contact with this personal information. And so clearly identifying where is that information and what is the risk to that information. That's the other piece of it, right? What is the risk to that information? You want to make sure you understand that risk, and so that you can then make a determination of the appropriate defenses to protect and secure that personal information. So data mapping, identifying what are your systems, what are your applications that do come into contact with personal information as defined by CCPA. Now, step 5 is where I think forward-thinking organizations is that we cannot be living in two different worlds where we have a privacy program that's disconnected from your cybersecurity program. And so one of the things that organizations, in terms of the fifth area from a best practice perspective that we are seeing organizations implement, is to identify a framework that allows the organization to address both privacy and security mandates. And I've got a slide towards the very end in the last section of my presentation when we'll be talking more about step 5. So step 5 is really important. And then encryption or redaction to reduce the risk to that personal information as defined by CCPA that your organization comes into contact with. So I think in 2021, this area of encryption is going to become more and more important, because if that information is not encrypted, let's say that your organization comes into contact with CCPA-based sensitive personal information, and you are not encrypting that information, and you have an incident, and that incident leads to a breach, now that could lead to a significant risk, financial risk to the organization. So I think organizations have to look very seriously at encryption in 2021, especially in the context of CCPA, to mitigate, to reduce that risk to all such information. And then number 7 is, are you sharing that information, this personal information that originated in your company, in your organization, with other organizations? So who are these vendors? What are your contracts? And are those contracts, have they been updated to reflect the CCPA mandate? So there's a lot of information packed in, but these are generally the 7 key areas from a best practice perspective, state of the industry, that we've seen a lot of organizations over the last 6-12 months, maybe 18 months, have taken deliberate, definitive steps to kind of really elevate their program and to demonstrate an evidence-ready CCPA compliance program. Ali Pabrai with EC First, again, very excited to be here with you today, and with all my colleagues at Isaka Orange County. And so this next section, policy foundation for practice. Policies are very important and lays the foundation. And the way we have to think about this in terms of make sure your assessment for CCPA readiness is completed first. And now you've got all the data points to clearly identify all of the updates that need to be made in your policies. And again, words of wisdom, Sun Tzu, ancients called a clever fighter is one who not only wins, but excels in winning with ease. And what we mean by that is you want to make sure that you've got all of these components appropriately implemented in your organization. So we've got some policy templates that we have developed over these years. And again, if you email me, I'll be happy to share a template so you can use that as a reference to build and customize for your own organization. But here are some examples of the type of statements that could be there in a CCPA policy document that is articulated by your organization. So first of all, clearly defining some key terms, and personal information obviously is very important, making sure that we clearly articulate what is the definition of personal information from the perspective of CCPA, and how does it actually impact in the context of other confidential and sensitive information your organization may be coming into contact with. And then there are some specific additional language and additional statements that we typically see when we work with organizations in terms of their policy readiness for CCPA compliance, is clearly stating the following purposes for which personal information may be collected, used, or shared, right? Shared is where you're potentially disclosing it. So being very specific in terms of what can or cannot be done with that type of information that your organization comes into contact with. So as I get to the last segment of my presentation, the key next steps, the wise warrior avoids the battle, right? And we got to be thinking ahead. That's the key point here. And Steve Jobs, God bless his soul, leader of Apple. And one of the things I read in his books, the book that stood out to me was, if you define the problem correctly, you almost have the solution. And I think we should think about this statement for a moment, defining the problem correctly. And all of us that are here today, we got to be thinking about compliance with CCPA, not just in terms of what is the mandate now, but what is this update coming up in a couple of years with respect to CCPA version 2.0, right? Proposition 24. And so very important that organizations, this is like a checklist, right? Are we doing this or are we not doing it? And we got to make sure that this is formal, that this is documented, that this is communicated, and so it resonates across the organization. So clearly establishing responsibility, that should be formally done in terms of role. Comprehensive and thorough risk assessment, you got to clearly identify where is it that you are coming into contact with this personal information, and what is it that you're doing with that personal information that your organization comes into contact with. And you may want to also include the scope of that risk assessment to be inclusive of a technical cybersecurity assessment, because I think you got to get those data points at about the same time. Then obviously you want to update your policies and procedures, and we highly recommend that organizations should have a unified suite of privacy policies and security policies, and that those policies reflect the multitude of compliance mandates you have to meet. Remediating the gaps that you've identified from step 2, I think that's very important. Looking at your supply chain, who are the vendors or the business associates that you may be sharing this CCPA defined personal information with, right? Training all members of the workforce so that they are not illiterate with respect to the standards, and then having active monitoring and management capabilities associated with controls that you've implemented within the organization. So it's very important that organizations, in terms of a checklist, and that's what we can think about this, and you got to go through these. There's no shortcut here, right? So assessment, first of all, responsibility, assessment, the upgrade to the policies, procedures, remediation, the corrective action plan to ensure those gaps are addressed, your vendors, because you may be sharing CCPA personal information with others, raising the level of literacy of CCPA within the organization, and then active monitoring of that. So here is a summary of some specific areas that got to make sure that we are addressing in terms of these policy updates. So this is again like a checklist that an organization can use to make a determination, have we addressed this from a policy perspective, and then how are we actually implementing this in terms of systems and applications. And I just introduced a couple of additional sites just to make sure. This is another California mandate. Some of you may be familiar with it. SB 327, IoT, cybersecurity, huge area of risk to organizations in 2021. And I think organizations need to pay particular attention to CCPA compliance, IoT, cybersecurity. And I think the third area that is an area of risk is ransomware that I talked about. And this is another great reference. If you Google Nist IR 8228, that's another great reference. You should download that. This allows you to unify your privacy and security. Now, the last slide that I just wanted to mention, this is a very new body of work that has been introduced to the industry, and many are not familiar with this. It's the Nist Special Publication 800-53, Release 5. And the reason I mention this, typically cybersecurity experts are very familiar with it, but what they've done with this body of work, they've unified security and privacy. And you can see the control family number 12. I've highlighted that. That's privacy authorization. So that may be something to think about for 2021 is can we use framework like 853 to bring these worlds together. So I'm very appreciative and very humbled to have had the opportunity to share and provide some insight on best practices and next steps with CCPA. I want to thank Pradeep and Bindu and Victor and so many others that have worked so hard to bring this event to you. And I know that we are all going to be learning immensely from the wonderful group of speakers that we have. Send me an email at ali.pabrai@tcfirst.com, and I look forward to hearing from you on LinkedIn. Control your excitement.